The day began like countless others had before it, slow and steady, born out of silence. Elijah had come to know the rhythm of mornings with an intimacy deeper than any friendship, deeper even than blood. Out here, mornings belonged to him alone, and for the past 10 years they had kept him alive as much as he had kept himself. He rose when the light rose, when the first thin blade of dawn cut across the wide-open sky and laid its pale fire over the sea of prairie grass that surrounded his cabin. There was no rooster to call him up, no voices in the next room, no sound of wagons rolling by on a road, just the raw, unshaped hush of wilderness, broken only by the stirring of wind and the breath of horses waiting in the corral. He sat up slowly on the cot that had become his bed, the legs groaning against the old wood floor. His back ached, as it always did, stiff from years of hard labor and nights on bedding that had never been meant for comfort. He rubbed a hand over his face, the skin rough, the beard thick and streaked with gray, his eyes still heavy but alert. The cabin around him was little more than 4 walls and a roof. He had built it himself, chopping and hauling logs until his muscles screamed, fitting each piece together with hands that bled until they hardened into tools of their own. There was nothing pretty about it. The walls were uneven in places, the floor slanted, the windows patched more than once, with glass scavenged from ruins of an old ranch house long abandoned. Yet it stood, solid against snow and wind and rain, and that was enough. The air inside was thick with the faint ash of last night's fire. He could still smell the smoke lingering in the hearth, could still taste the bitterness of coffee that had long gone cold. On the table lay a lantern and an old Bible, its cover stiff with dust. He had not opened it in years. Faith, like people, was something he had left behind when he came here. He had wanted only the company of earth and sky, nothing more, and for a long time he had told himself it was enough. He pulled on his boots. The leather cracked as his foot pressed down, the sound of it echoing in the silence like a reminder that even objects aged in solitude. He pulled his coat tight, heavy and worn, smelling faintly of horse sweat and the faint tang of smoke. Every movement he made was deliberate, practiced. There was no rush in his life anymore, no reason to hurry. The world moved in its own slope, way out here, and Elijah had long since learned to move with it. He pushed open the door and stepped onto the porch. The first breath of morning air filled his lungs, cool and sharp. The horizon was awash with gold and pink, streaks of fire stretching across the sky like the brushstrokes of a painter who had no concern for perfection but every gift for grandeur. The grass shimmered with dew, thousands of tiny diamonds catching the newborn light. A hawk wheeled overhead, its cry carrying over the plains, piercing the quiet but not shattering it. Somewhere far away, the low sound of running water drifted across the land, the creek that had sustained him all these years, murmuring like a secret too old to be spoken aloud. This was his world, simple and still. He had cut himself away from everything else, the towns filled with noise and lies, the faces of men who had called themselves friends but turned their backs, the memories of war, of fire, of a family he could never return to. Out here, none of it could touch him. Out here, he had thought himself untouchable, invisible, but as he stood there, the air felt different. It was subtle, so subtle he might have ignored it if his instincts hadn't been sharpened by years of listening to the land. There was a weight in the stillness, a pause in the breath of morning. It felt as if the earth itself had stilled, waiting, watching. His hand lingered on the latch of the door, as if some small voice inside him whispered caution. But routine was a stubborn thing, and so he pushed the door wide, expecting nothing beyond the porch but endless sky. And then he saw him, a boy. Elijah froze. Every muscle in his body locked. It had been 10 years since he had seen another human face, and now here, standing barefoot on his porch, as if summoned out of the very earth, was a child. The boy could not have been older than 7. His frame was small, thin, fragile enough that the prairie wind seemed strong enough to carry him away. His hair fell long around his face, tangled, streaked with dust. His skin was marked by travel, scratched, bruised, sun-darkened by a merciless sky. His feet, bare and cracked, told of miles walked over rock and thorn and earth with no shelter. His clothes hung off him in tatters, ragged at the knees, threadbare at the sleeves. But it was not the boy's clothing, nor his state, that struck Elijah to his core. It was his eyes. They were wide, dark, steady. They did not belong to a child. They did not carry the innocence of youth or the fear Elijah might have expected. They carried weight, an old weight, as if they had seen too much, carried too much. It was not fear that lived in them, but purpose. The boy did not speak. He simply stood there, rooted to the boards of the porch as if he had grown from them, and extended a hand. In that hand was a folded piece of paper. Elijah stared. The edges of the paper were frayed, the folds soft and worn, the surface smudged with dirt and sweat. It had traveled far. He could see that at once. This was no fresh note carried from one town to another. This was a relic of a journey, something born through distance and hardship. And here it was, offered to him. For a long moment, Elijah did not move. His world had been silence, and silence was what he trusted. Silence meant safety, meant control. But the presence of this child, the paper in his hand, was louder than any shout. It was intrusion, disruption, a breaking of the order he had carved for himself. His heart thudded in his chest, not from fear, but from something stranger: recognition, dread, curiosity, all tangled together. The boy's hand trembled, not from hesitation but from exhaustion. His small body swayed slightly, as if the weight of the journey was finally pressing down now that his mission had reached its end. Yet his eyes never faltered. They fixed on Elijah with a steadiness that spoke louder than words. "This is for you. I was sent to you. Take it." Elijah reached out, slowly, his weathered fingers brushing the boy's hand. The skin beneath his touch was dry, cracked, the hand of someone who had walked too far without comfort. A child's hand should have been soft. This one felt like stone. He closed his fingers around the letter, and in that moment the silence of 10 years shattered. The boy lowered his arm, but he did not move, did not speak. He only watched, as though waiting for the man before him to unfold the paper and let its truth be spoken aloud. Elijah held it tight, staring at its folds, knowing that whatever lay within had been carried here for him alone. He had not expected another soul on his land for years, but the world had found him, and it had found him in the most unlikely form: a child, barefoot and determined, with a letter that bore the weight of memory and the promise of change. And though Elijah had not yet opened it, he felt already that nothing in his life would ever again be the same. Elijah's hands trembled as he stared down at the folded paper. He had not held a letter in more than a decade, not since the day he turned his back on towns and telegraphs, on people and their endless words. His world had become one without ink, without messages, without voices other than the wind and the whisper of horses. And yet, here it was, small and fragile in his hand. As if all of the years he had kept silence at bay had been undone in an instant. The paper felt oddly heavy, as though it carried more than words. It carried years. It carried ghosts. The boy watched him, silent still, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Elijah lowered himself slowly onto the porch step, the wood creaking beneath his weight, and brought the paper closer to his eyes. His hands shook not from weakness, though his bones were worn with age and labor, but from something deeper. A stirring in his chest he had not felt in so long that he barely recognized it. Fear of memory, fear of recognition, fear that the past, which he had buried beneath miles of prairie and walls of solitude, had finally found its way back to him. He slid his calloused thumb beneath the fold and pried it open. The crackle of old paper filled the air, sharper than the hawk's cry, louder than the rustle of grass. He unfolded it once, then again, the creases reluctant to release themselves after so many miles of being clenched in the boy's hand. Last, it lay open, trembling in the breeze, and the words rose up from the page, as if written in fire. The script was a woman's hand, uneven, hurried perhaps, but still legible. He read the first line aloud under his breath, the sound of his own voice startling him as though it belonged to another man, to the man who saved my life. The words struck him like a hammer. His throat tightened, his vision blurred. For a long moment he could not breathe. It was as if the years themselves had folded in on him, dragging him back through time, back to faces he had long since forced himself to forget. He could see her, though the name did not yet surface. Though the image was still blurred at the edges, he could see her eyes, hollow with despair, see the trembling of her hands, hear the break in her voice when she spoke of the darkness she could not bear. Years ago, when the world was darker than I could bear, you gave me back hope. The letters swam before him. His chest ached with the weight of it. He had saved many in his time on battlefields, on trails, in towns on the edge of law and ruin. But he had never thought of himself as a savior. He was a man who did what was before him, nothing more. To hear it spoken written like this, as though he had been a light in someone else's storm, unsettled him in ways he could not explain. He had not been anyone's hope for a long, long time. His eyes moved to the next line, and it was as though the air itself fell silent around him. Now I am gone, but I send you my son. Protect him, as you once protected me. The words burned into him. I am gone. He closed his eyes, his jaw clenching. Whoever she was, this woman, this voice from the past, she was dead. The letter was not a greeting, not a remembrance, but a will, a final plea. And the boy before him, small and tired, and silent, was the legacy she had left behind. Her blood, her son. Elijah lowered the letter into his lap, staring at the boy. The child met his gaze without flinching, though his body sagged with exhaustion. There was no question in his eyes, no hesitation. He stood as if he had known all along that this was where he was meant to be delivered. That this man, the one who had not spoken to another living soul in a decade, was the one meant to take him in. Elijah's throat was dry. Words tangled in his chest but would not leave his lips. His mind raced backward, clawing through memory. Who was she? Whose face had he once lifted from despair? Whose hand had he steadied? Whose path had he changed? He thought of the years of wandering, the battles and the roads, the countless strangers whose lives had crossed his. It could have been anyone, and yet, not anyone. This letter had found its way to him. The boy had found his way to him. He looked back down at the paper, running his finger over the ink as though touch alone could call forth the ghost of the woman who had written it. He imagined her sitting somewhere, perhaps in candlelight, her hand shaking as she pressed these words onto paper. He imagined the sound of her breath as she wrote his name, even if she did not write it on the page. He imagined the weight she carried, the knowing that she would not live to see her child grow, that she would place his future in the hands of a man who had once been her salvation. Elijah's chest tightened. He had left the world to escape responsibility, to escape the weight of other lives pressing down on his own. For 10 years, he had told himself he owed nothing to anyone. And yet here it was, written in ink, carried across miles, laid into his hand, a responsibility greater than any he had borne before. A child, a life, not a passing stranger or a comrade on the field, but a boy of blood and bone, entrusted to him by the memory of a woman he could not yet fully recall. The boy shifted, slightly, his small body swaying. Elijah saw the way his shoulders drooped, the way his lips parted, as though he had walked to the very end of his strength. And still, he had carried the letter. Still, he had come. The boy's silence spoke louder than any words. I am here because she believed you would protect me. Do not prove her wrong. Elijah folded the letter slowly, his hands no steadier than before. He could feel his heartbeat hammering against his ribs, a sound that seemed too loud in the morning air. He slid the paper into the pocket of his coat, as though to keep it close, as though the weight of it would anchor him against the storm rising in his chest. He looked at the boy once more. Dust clung to the child's skin, his hair matted, his body worn, and yet those eyes, dark, steady, filled with something older than his years, held him captive. Elijah had lived 10 years without purpose, 10 years with nothing but silence. But as he stared into the boy's gaze, he felt it, the stirrings of something new, not chosen, not asked for, but given to him nonetheless. A mission, a charge, a promise written in a dying woman's hand, and though he did not yet know how, though he did not yet even remember her name, Elijah knew with a certainty that shook him. He could not turn away. Elijah remained frozen on the porch, the letter still burning in his pocket, his gaze fixed on the boy. The child's silence did not unsettle him the way most silences did. Elijah had spent so long immersed in quiet that he could tell the difference between emptiness and intention. This boy's silence was not born of fear, nor of hesitation. It was watchful, steady, a kind of silent strength that seemed far too old for a face so young. And it was in those eyes, dark as riverstone, sharp as flint, that Elijah felt the tremor of recognition. He tried to summon her. Whoever she had been, the woman who had written those words, the one who now lay beneath earth or ashes, her memory should have come rushing back at the sight of her son. But his mind, stubborn from years of solitude, resisted. Names and faces blurred together like dust swirling in wind. 10 years was long enough for memory to rot, for sharp images to dull into shapes and shadows. He thought of nights in border towns, of camps in wild country, of voices murmuring in gratitude or desperation. He thought of the hundreds he had crossed paths with and tried to recall which pair of eyes had once held that same unshakable steadiness. The boy shifted, but not with nervousness. His stance was rooted, as though he belonged here, though Elijah could not imagine how. He tilted his head, studying Elijah with the same intensity that Elijah used to study him. It felt less like a meeting and more like a reckoning, as though the child was measuring him, not his strength, not his size, but something deeper. His worth, his truth. Elijah's chest tightened. He had never been good at remembering faces. In his line of work, whatever that had once been faces came and went, fleeting as smoke. But eyes, the eyes he remembered. He had always believed that a man's eyes carried more truth than his words. And now, staring into the boy's gaze, he felt the faint echo of another pair. A woman's, dark, steady, unafraid, even in her lowest moment. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing the memory to surface. He saw flickers, a night lit by firelight, shadows dancing across a weary face, a voice that cracked with sorrow but did not break, a hand that trembled until it found his and steadied. She had looked at him as though he were not just a stranger, passing through, but the one soul who could pull her back from the edge. And in that moment, whatever he had said, whatever he had done, he must have answered that call. When he opened his eyes again, the boy was still there, still watching him, and Elijah realized with a jolt that this was no accident. The resemblance was not only in the eyes. There was something in the set of his jaw, in the stubborn line of his brow, that echoed the woman from his fragmented memory. Blood had a way of carrying more than features. It carried resolve, spirit, the unspoken essence of a person. And here it was, staring at him in the form of a child. Elijah's throat worked, but no words came. How could he speak when he did not even know what to say? How could he claim recognition when memory betrayed him? And yet, he felt it, deep within, a stirring that told him this was not a coincidence. The years might have buried her name, might have scattered the details of her story, but the truth of her remained. She had been real. She had been saved. And now, through her son, she had returned. The land around them seemed to fall into deeper stillness. The wind slowed. The grass leaned without whispering, even the horses beyond the corral stilled their restless shifting. It was as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for Elijah to acknowledge what his heart already knew, that this boy was more than a stranger, more than a burden left at his door. He was a link, a living thread tying Elijah back to a moment he had nearly forgotten, moment that had mattered more than most. Elijah pressed his palms against his knees, grounding himself. He had lived 10 years in deliberate isolation, hiding from memory, from responsibility, from the pull of human connection. And yet, in a single morning, that wall had begun to crumble. The boy's eyes were a hammer against the stone he had built. Around himself, each glance, each steady beat of silence between them, chipped away at the solitude he had clung to for so long. He thought of the woman again, forcing his mind back into the shadows where her image flickered. Who had she been? A settler's wife, a wanderer, a native woman caught between worlds. He could not place her, but he remembered the way she had looked at him. No, not just looked, but seen. Few had ever seen him for what he was, beneath the dust and the scars. She had. Now her son was here, with the same gaze, carrying the same silent weight. A strange mixture of emotions flooded him: guilt that he could not even recall her name, sorrow that she had died and left her son orphaned, but also something else, something he had not felt in years: purpose. The realization that whatever had once passed between himself and the boy's mother had not ended in that long-ago night. It had rippled forward, through years, across miles, into this very moment on his porch. She had trusted him then, and she trusted him still, enough to send her son. Elijah exhaled slowly, his breath trembling. He knew, without needing to say it aloud, that his life had shifted. The boy was no longer just a figure on his doorstep. He was a reminder, a responsibility, a second chance at something Elijah had long believed lost. The boy blinked, his lashes heavy with dust, but his stare did not waver. Elijah met it fully this time, no longer turning inward, no longer trying to resist. And in that exchange of gazes, wordless, yet undeniable, Elijah felt the faint stirrings of recognition bloom into certainty. He had seen those eyes before, and they had once changed everything, and now, they would change him again. The words hung in the morning air like a tolling bell, clear, undeniable, and heavy with the kind of truth that left no room for argument. Elijah had lived a decade without the sound of another human voice, and now the very first words to pierce that silence were these: "My mother said you saved her life." They were not spoken with hesitation or hope, but with the calm certainty of a child repeating a commandment, a sacred truth handed down like scripture. The boy's voice was low, yet steady, far steadier than Elijah's own breath as he listened. It was not the voice of a beggar, nor of a wanderer asking for mercy. It was the voice of someone carrying out an oath, too young to fully understand its depth, yet too loyal to falter in its delivery. Each syllable seemed carved into stone, as if his mother's instructions had been etched into his very soul. "My mother said you saved her life." The phrase hit Elijah like a hammer against rusted iron, sparking a flood of memories he had buried too deep for daylight. His chest tightened as though the plains themselves had leaned in, pressing against him, urging him to remember, to face what he had spent 10 years denying. Somewhere in the desert of his mind, a woman's voice stirred, fragile but unbroken, echoing faintly through the corridors of memory. She had said something to him once, words laced with gratitude, words he had dismissed because gratitude had always made him uneasy. He could never carry thanks. Well, it clung like a weight he hadn't asked for. And yet, here it was again, carried forward by her son, more binding now than it had ever been before. The boy's eyes did not waver. He lifted the letter again, holding it higher, urging Elijah to take it. The paper trembled in his small hand, edges curling from long travel, corners smudged with the dirt of countless miles. But Elijah knew that the tremor was not born of fear. The boy was not afraid of him, not afraid of being here. No, the shaking was from the burden of duty, the sheer magnitude of carrying his mother's last will across untold distances, and, now, placing it into the hands of the man she had named her savior. Elijah stared at that letter, unable to move. It was not just paper. It was a bridge between past and present, between a choice he had made long ago and the consequences that had finally come to claim him. It was as though all the years of silence had only been a pause, a holding of breath, waiting for this very moment. His hand twitched at his side, wanting to reach, but he hesitated. What if he took it, and the words inside demanded more than he could give? What if the letter stripped away the fragile peace he had carved for himself in solitude? What if the truth revealed in ink undid the man he had become in exile? He had faced storms, wild men, and the long merciless nights of the plains. But this was the kind of danger he had no defense against. Memory, obligation, redemption. Boy's voice returned, softer this time, but carrying an edge that pierced Elijah deeper than any knife. "She told me, if anything ever happened to her, I must find you." The sentence unraveled the last of Elijah's resistance. He felt the ground shift beneath him, not with the physical rumble of thunder or hoofbeats, but with the quake of destiny aligning itself. This boy had not come by accident. His mother's words had charted his path, like stars guiding a traveler through the dark. Her final breath must have carried Elijah's name, her last thought tethered to the man who had once pulled her from death's reach. Elijah's heart pounded, the rhythm echoing in his ears like distant drums. He wanted to speak, to ask who she had been to him beyond that night, to know why she had believed so fiercely in his name. But his tongue was heavy, locked tight against the storm of questions rising inside. He could only stare at the letter, at the boy's unwavering hand, and feel the storm gather behind his ribs. And then it broke. Not with thunder, not with rain, but with memory crashing back over him. He was there again, years ago, dust in the air, the copper scent of blood thick on his tongue, a woman's scream cutting through the night. He saw her face in fragments, eyes wide but unyielding, a hand clutching at life with everything she had. He remembered stepping between her and death, not because he sought heroism, but because something inside him refused to watch her fall. He had pulled her from the abyss, and in that moment she had looked at him with eyes so steady, so unafraid, that he had never forgotten their weight. Now her son stood before him with the same gaze, carrying her final testament in trembling fingers. Elijah reached out at last. His hand shook not with age, not with weakness, but with the knowledge that what he was about to hold would shatter the quiet existence he had built. His fingertips brushed the crumpled paper, and the boy released it instantly, as though it had only ever belonged in Elijah's keeping. The letter was lighter than he expected, yet it burned like fire in his palm. He closed his fist around it, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The world seemed to wait, the silence so deep it rang in his ears. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried, its voice sharp against the vast sky. But here, on the porch, all was still. Elijah's breath came ragged, each inhale pulling ghosts from the shadows of his mind. He looked down at the boy district barefoot, a child who should have been playing in open fields rather than bearing the weight of a dying mother's last wish. And yet he carried it without faltering, his shoulders squared, his eyes unbroken. Elijah felt something stir within him that he had thought dead, the recognition of purpose, the acceptance of duty. The past had come for him, carried not on the wind or in whispers, but in the flesh and blood of a child who refused to bow. And Elijah knew, with the clarity of a man standing at the edge of two worlds, that his solitude had ended. The storm of memory had broken over him, and there was no turning back. The letter felt impossibly fragile in Elijah's calloused hands, as if time itself might crumble it to dust if he held it too tightly. His fingers trembled as he worked the folds open, each crease carrying the weight of years and miles. The boy's eyes never left him. He stood silent, still as stone, as though he too understood that what was about to be revealed would change everything. Elijah had faced storms that bent trees to splinters, nights so cold they cut into bone, and men with steel in their hands and murder in their eyes. He had faced them all without flinching. But this was different. This was not a test of survival, not the clash of man against wilderness or man against man. This was a reckoning with memory, with the part of himself he had buried beneath dust and silence. At last, the letter came free, unfolding into a single sheet, its edges yellowed, its ink faded but still alive. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, though smudged here and there, the strokes betraying a woman who had written through pain and exhaustion. Elijah's throat tightened at the sight. His pulse thudded in his ears, as if even his blood knew what was about to come. He lowered himself onto the wooden chair by the porch, the boards creaking under his weight. The boy did not move closer, did not speak, only watched with those steady, unyielding eyes. Elijah flattened the paper against his knee and forced himself to read. The first word struck him like a bullet to the chest. "You once saved my life." It was not a flourish, not a plea, just a truth, set down with the simplicity of someone who had no time for anything but honesty. Elijah's breath hitched. He remembered her now, not her name, not fully, but the moment, the night, the blood, the way he had pulled her from the grasp of death, with hands that shook as they do now. She had survived, and he had ridden away before dawn, convinced their paths would never cross again. And yet here was her voice, carried across years and distance, reaching him as if no time had passed at all. "I lived because of you, and for that, there are no words enough. Gratitude cannot repay the debt, nor can time erase what you gave me. You gave me my life, and in return, I give you the only thing I have left, my son." Elijah's heart clenched as his eyes moved down the page. The ink blurred, not yet from tears but from the sheer force of the emotions breaking through his long-buried defenses. He read slowly, savoring each line, as though to rush them would dishonor the woman who had taken her last strength to write them. "He is all I am. He is my breath, my laughter, my hope. If you are reading this, then I am gone, and he carries my last wish. Protect him, as you once protected me. Give him the chance at life that I was given through your hand. Let him live, let him grow, let him find joy in a world that has been so cruel. If you do this, the debt between us will be fulfilled." By the time Elijah reached these words, his chest ached as though the letter itself had pressed the air from his lungs. He set it down briefly, his fingers brushing the edges, afraid to lose his grip. The boy still watched, silent, waiting, trusting. Elijah lifted the paper again. The last lines were shorter, the handwriting weaker, trailing as though the ink itself had struggled to keep up with her fading strength. I could not choose where my road would end, but I could choose to place his road in your hands. And if he stands before you now, then I know my trust was not misplaced. For you are the man who once saved me. Save him now. The words blurred suddenly, the letters swimming, and Elijah blinked hard. His throat burned, his jaw clenched, but still, the tears refused to fall. He had not cried in decades. Tears were a luxury he had left behind with the world of people, of family, of love. Yet now, staring at the testament of a woman who had believed in him beyond reason, he felt the sting of them pressing against his eyes, threatening to break free. He folded the letter back with painstaking care, as though closing it too quickly might undo her last will. His hands shook, not with age, but with the weight of the promise pressed into his palms. Elijah leaned back, staring out across the endless plains. The horizon was the same as it had been every morning for 10 years, empty and vast, but now it felt different, charged, alive, as though it, too, waited for his answer. His mind raced. He had built a life of silence, a fortress against the world. He had sworn never to bind himself to another soul again, not after the losses that had hollowed him out. But this was not about choice anymore. The boy's presence, the letter in his hands, the voice of a dying woman, etched in ink, they had bound him tighter than any oath he could ever speak aloud. The boy shifted then, just slightly, his bare feet stirring the dust. The sound was soft, but it was enough to break Elijah's trance. He looked at the child again, not as a stranger, not as a burden, but as living proof of a moment in his past when he had chosen to act, to save. This boy was the legacy of that choice, the continuation of a life spared. Elijah exhaled slowly, the breath shuddering out of him. For the first time in years, he felt the sting of tears he could no longer hold back. One slipped free, trailing, hot against his weathered cheek, and he did not wipe it away. The boy said nothing, did nothing, only stood rooted in quiet strength, as though he knew the weight of what had just been asked. The cowboy's hands lowered, the letter still clutched tightly, and he whispered not to the boy, not to the plains, but to the memory of the woman whose words had just shattered the walls around him. I hear you. And with those 3 words, the silence of 10 years was broken, not by accident, but by destiny. The porch boards groaned softly beneath Elijah's weight as he sat frozen, the letter still clutched in his hands. Time seemed to stretch thin, fragile, as though the world itself had stopped turning to watch what choice he might make. His eyes drifted across the faded ink once more, though he did not read it again. He did not need to. Every word had already etched itself into him, carved into the marrow of his bones where they could not be forgotten. For a long while, there was nothing to sound but the whisper of the wind moving across the endless grasses. No movement but the slight tremor of his own hands. The boy remained still, no fidget, no fear, as though he too understood that this silence was not emptiness but transformation. Elijah's life had been a vast, unbroken solitude, a decade carved out of the desert's bones. He had thought himself finished with people, finished with promises, finished with the weight of lives other than his own. He had made peace, if it could be called peace, with the silence of his days, convincing himself that loneliness was safer than love, that absence was gentler than loss. And yet, here sat a boy with eyes steady as stone and a letter heavy as judgment, proving that no man could ever truly bury himself away from the pull of destiny. He drew in a deep breath and finally lifted his gaze to the child before him. For the first time, he did not see only dust and weariness clinging to a small frame. He did not see a stranger left at his door like a burden or a puzzle to be solved. He saw the curve of a jawline that stirred faint memory, the steadiness of a gaze too old for such a young face, the silent courage of a heart that had already endured too much. The boy was not just a boy. He was a message, a living summons. Something within Elijah shifted then, not a violent upheaval, but a quiet breaking open, as if a door long barred inside him had cracked wide and let in the light. For 10 years he had been only one thing, a cowboy surviving the days, moving through routine like a man already half in the grave. But in that single moment of looking into the boy's eyes, he realized he was being called into something greater than survival. The letter had not asked him to remember, it had commanded him to act. The boy's mother had not left her child to chance. She had trusted him, specifically him, as though she had known all along that he could not refuse when the hour came. The wind stirred across the plains then, brushing through the dry grass, rattling the porch boards, tugging at the brim of Elijah's hat. It carried with it the scent of distant dust sage, the faint promise of rain far to the west. But to Elijah, it felt like more than wind. It felt like a voice, wordless but clear, urging him forward. His chest tightened with the knowledge that the road before him had changed forever. He could no longer be only the man he had been. The boy had ended that life simply by arriving. Elijah thought of the years he had wasted hiding from the world, the nights staring into firelight with No voice to answer him. The mornings when the sun rose, only to mark another day survived, not lived. For so long, he had believed there was nothing left worth holding on to. But now, staring into those dark, unwavering eyes, he realized how wrong he had been. The boy had not intruded upon his solitude. He had delivered purpose. Elijah's breath came heavy, roughened by 1,000 unspoken words. He lowered the letter slowly, carefully, and rested it against his thigh. Then he leaned forward just slightly, meeting the boy's gaze as though sealing some silent agreement. "You're not alone anymore," he murmured, though the words were swallowed almost immediately by the wind. And in that moment, he was no longer just Elijah the cowboy, the recluse who had lived like a ghost on the edges of the world. He was something else: protector, guardian, bearer of a promise larger than himself. The horizon stretched before him as it always had, wide and endless, but for the first time in years it did not look empty. It looked like a road not meant to be traveled alone. Elijah knew then that the course of his life had been rewritten, not by his own choosing, but by the quiet hand of fate that had placed a child at his door and a letter in his grasp. And as the wind swept across the plains, he did not resist. He let it carry him forward, into a future that was no longer his alone. The silence of the prairie pressed close again, but it was not the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of something just beginning. And deep inside, where he had long thought himself deadened, Elijah felt the first stirrings of life returning.